Ladies and gentlemen, you've stopped apologizing for who you are, not in a loud, defiant way. Not in the kind of way that needs to be posted on a billboard or screamed from a rooftop, but in the quiet moments, the ones when no one's watching, you've made a decision to stand by yourself. You've chosen day by day to stop editing your words just to make someone else more comfortable. You've stopped second-guessing your reactions, your thoughts, your intuition, your fire. And that shift, though it may seem small from the outside, is the loudest declaration of healing there is. There was a time you apologized for everything, for speaking too much, for not speaking enough, for asking questions, for having needs, for wanting clarity, for having an opinion. You carried your self-worth like a fragile glass, always one wrong word away from being shattered by someone else's disapproval. And you didn't even realize how deeply that conditioning ran until you started to notice the silence that followed your truth. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of disapproval, of judgment, of withdrawal. You learned to preempt pain by offering apologies like they were armor. But they weren't armor. They were chains. You began to see that every time you apologized for something that wasn't actually wrong, every time you made yourself small, agreeable, invisible, you weren't just keeping the peace. You were erasing yourself. And no matter how much you tried to make someone else happy, it was never enough. You realized that the more you gave up pieces of yourself, the more you were punished, not rewarded. That people who genuinely love you never ask you to apologize for who you are. They don't weaponize your kindness or twist your vulnerability into weakness, but the ones who do. They need you to stay small so they can stay in control, so you stopped, slowly at first. You caught yourself in the middle of a sentence, sorry, and paused. You asked yourself, am I really sorry? Or am I just afraid of how they'll react? You noticed the way your body tensed up before you asked for what you needed, the way your voice softened to make yourself seem less much, the way you tiptoed around someone else's ego like it was sacred ground and you were the intruder. And you asked yourself why? You didn't change overnight? This kind of healing isn't linear. It comes in waves, some days strong and brave, others trembling and uncertain, but you began to rebuild, not to become someone new, but to return to who you were before you started apologizing for your existence. You began to speak more directly. You stopped cushioning every truth with 10 disclaimers. You let yourself feel anger without calling it overreacting. You let yourself want things without labeling it selfish. You let yourself say no without justifying it with a long-winded explanation. And people noticed. Some pulled away. Some grew louder in their criticism. Some tried harder to make you doubt yourself because they could feel their grip slipping. But others leaned in. They respected your boundaries. They celebrated your voice. They admired your courage to show up, not as a polished version of who you thought you needed to be, but as your full, real, flawed, feeling self. And that contrast, that stark difference, showed you everything you needed to know. You began to realize that apologizing for your personality, your passions, your emotions was never about being polite. It was about survival. You were taught that love was conditional, that belonging required performance, that approval had to be earned. So of course you apologized. Of course you tried to mold yourself into the shape that fit the people around you. You thought that was what it meant to be worthy. But now you know better. You know that real love doesn't need you to shrink. It invites you to expand. It doesn't silence your truth, it honors it. And even when it's uncomfortable, it doesn't ask you to betray yourself for the sake of harmony. Because you've learned through painful experience that peace bought with self-abandonment is not peace. It's captivity. Now, when someone tries to guilt you for setting a boundary, you don't apologize. When someone tells you you're too sensitive, you don't shrink, you lean into your sensitivity as a strength. When someone accuses you of being too much, you understand that it's a reflection of their limitations, not your worth. And when you feel the urge to over-explain, over-apologize, or over-function to keep someone else comfortable, you pause. You breathe, you come back home to yourself, because the truth is you've fought hard to get here. You've walked through gaslighting, manipulation, and emotional contortion just to be allowed a seat at a table that was never built for you. And now you build your own. Now you take up space. Now you speak even when your voice shakes. Now you exist without needing permission. Now you know that your presence is not a problem to solve. It is a truth to be honored. You are no longer living in the shadows of someone else's insecurity. You are no longer dancing for approval that only comes when you lose yourself. You are no longer editing. Your essence to be digestible to people who only love the version of you they could control. You've stopped apologizing not because you're arrogant, not because you've stopped growing, but because you've started loving yourself enough to stop begging for love from places that require your silence. And that shift is everything. There was a time when you questioned every decision you made, every emotion you felt, every hunch that rose up in your chest. You second-guessed yourself to exhaustion. You'd feel something deeply unsettling in your body, but you'd silence it with logic, with guilt, or with the hope that maybe you were just imagining things. You told yourself to give people the benefit of the doubt, to not be dramatic, to be understanding, to be kind even when the knot in your stomach tightened and your heart whispered something isn't right. You learned early, maybe through experiences or survival, that doubting yourself was safer than trusting yourself. That if you listened to your instincts and turned out to be wrong, the shame would eat you alive. So you began to outsource your decisions. You asked for advice, even when you already knew what you needed. You asked for permission to feel what you were feeling. You explained away your discomfort, rationalized your confusion, and ignored your gut because it didn't come with a spreadsheet or hard evidence. And every time you ignored it, you gave more power to someone else's version of reality and chipped away at your own. But your gut never left you. It stayed quiet in the background, whispering truths that your mind wasn't ready to face. It showed up in moments you tried to dismiss the way your body recoiled when you were told something that didn't sit right. The flicker of unease. When you were being manipulated, the heavy stillness that settled in your chest after a conversation that looked fine on the surface but felt deeply wrong. Your body always knew. It always tried to protect you. It always pointed you back to truth, even when your mind was wrapped up in denial or fear. It's a brutal thing to realize how many times you were right. How many times your body knew the truth, but you talked yourself out of it because someone else convinced you that you were overreacting, or that you were too emotional, or that you didn't have all the facts, or that you were making things up. You started to believe them. You stopped believing yourself. And over time, the more you denied your inner knowing, the more lost you felt. The more you needed external validation, the more you needed someone else to tell you what was real and what wasn't, because you were taught to mistrust your own perception. But there comes a moment, a sharp, pivotal moment, when you can no longer ignore the truth. When the dissonance between what's being said and what's being felt becomes unbearable. When the weight of pretending not to know becomes heavier than the fear of facing what you already do. That's when things start to shift. Slowly, maybe even painfully, but they shift. You begin to look back and realize, I knew. I always knew. You see all the signs you dismissed. You see all the moments you felt something but pushed it down because it wasn't convenient to trust yourself. You begin to understand that your intuition isn't just some vague spiritual concept, it's your body's wisdom. It's your nervous system sending you signals. It's your lived experience surfacing as an internal compass. It's the accumulated data of your life showing up as instinct. It's not always logical, but it's deeply intelligent. And the more you listen, the louder it gets. So you start listening, not perfectly, not all at once, but you stop rushing through the red flags. You stop asking for 15 opinions when you already feel the answer. You stop assuming that someone else's confidence means they're right. You begin to honor the signal's tightness in your chest, heat in your face, tension in your shoulders, not as inconveniences, but as messages. You pause. You pay attention. You let your body speak. And then something beautiful happens. You begin to act from that place of knowing. You walk away from conversations that leave you feeling hollow. You say no without having to explain it. You set boundaries even when people don't like them. You stop needing a justification for your discomfort. You allow yourself to feel uneasy and still trust that the feeling is real, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. You begin to trust yourself in rooms where you used to doubt everything. You stop second-guessing your voice. You understand that your clarity doesn't need to be debated to be valid. Trusting your gut doesn't mean you never get it wrong. It doesn't mean you become invincible or immune to manipulation. But it means that when something feels off, you no longer override that feeling in the name of politeness, approval, or fear. You give yourself permission to respond to what is, not what you wish it was. You stop needing to explain your reality to people who are committed to misunderstanding it. You begin to trust that if your inner world is saying no, even when everything looks fine on paper, that no is enough. You also start noticing that the more you listen, the more you build evidence that your gut can be trusted. You make a decision that feels right in your body, and later you see just how necessary it was. You choose to walk away, and clarity follows. You say what you need to say, and peace takes its place. You begin to trust your rhythm, your pace, your needs. And in doing so, you stop performing and start living. You start showing up not to please or to prove, but to be in alignment with yourself. It's not always easy. In fact, it can be brutally hard. especially when people around you don't understand. Especially when you disappoint those who benefited from your doubt, especially when trusting your gut means choosing the harder path. But what you gain is worth it. You gain your voice, your sovereignty, your truth. And once you experience the power of that alignment, once you've stood in a room, heard the noise, felt the chaos, and chosen to listen to yourself anyway, you never forget that feeling. That's the kind of freedom no one can give you and no one can take away. There was a time when the rush of unpredictability felt like love. The tension, the intensity, the push and pull, it lit something up inside of you. It felt alive, magnetic, electric. The dramatic apologies, the high-stakes arguments, the adrenaline of not knowing what would happen next, they were packaged as passion. And when it was good, it was so good, so intoxicating, so consuming that it blurred out the moments it was devastating. You convinced yourself this was just how real love looked: messy, wild, uncontainable. You confused the chaos for chemistry because it mirrored what you'd learned somewhere along the way, that love had to be fought for, that if it didn't hurt a little, it wasn't deep. That being on edge meant being in love. You didn't realize it at the time, but your nervous system had adapted to survive instability. That stormy dynamic where one minute you felt worshipped and the next discarded trained your body to equate unpredictability with importance. You mistook the spikes of anxiety for butterflies. You mistook the high of reconciliation after conflict for intimacy. You mistook possessiveness for love. You didn't know that healthy love is actually calm, and calm felt foreign, almost boring. If someone was consistent, you'd question their interest. If someone respected your space, you'd wonder if they even cared. If someone didn't trigger your fight or flight response, you'd assume there was no spark. You had been conditioned to need emotional whiplash to feel wanted. That chaos held you hostage, and you didn't even know you were in chains. You thought the highs were worth the lows. You told yourself you were just emotional, just passionate, just invested. But underneath that surface was a fear you weren't ready to name, the fear that stillness meant abandonment, that predictability meant disinterest, that someone not blowing up your phone or accusing you of something or pulling you into a dramatic scene meant they didn't love you. You've been taught that drama equals desire, that confusion is a natural part of intimacy, that being needed so badly someone loses control is a compliment, but it's not. It's a warning. As you started to wake up from the spell, it didn't happen in one big realization. It happened in fragments. You started to notice how drained you were all the time, how you couldn't focus, how your body ached in ways that had no clear explanation, how you were always bracing for something, how even in the quiet moments your mind wouldn't rest. You lived on emotional edge, hypervigilant, guarded, exhausted. You didn't even know what peace felt like anymore. You began to question what you once accepted. You began to see how many of your passionate connections were actually just emotional roller coasters, built on control, built on fear, built on performative intensity instead of genuine closeness. You saw how you'd been manipulated with love bombs and praise only to be punished with silence or cruelty. How you were drawn in with words but left starving for action. You started to realize that someone yelling, "I can't live without you," wasn't romantic, it was a red flag. You began to understand that emotional chaos is not love, it's volatility. And when that truth finally started to land, something inside of you cracked open. You began the hard work of detoxing from chaos. You began to unlearn the wiring that told you peace was suspicious. You started to explore what real connection looks like without the fireworks, without the turmoil, without the constant fear of being discarded. You started to choose people who showed up, not just when it was convenient, but consistently. You let yourself be drawn to kindness, to reliability, to calm energy. And at first it felt weird. It felt too quiet, too soft, too steady. You questioned it. You wondered if you were settling. If this was what numbness felt like. Because for so long, drama felt like desire. Silence felt like danger. But over time, your nervous system began to regulate. You started to feel safe in spaces that didn't need fixing. You began to feel at home in your own body. You no longer woke up waiting for the emotional temperature of someone else to dictate your day. You began to breathe more deeply, laugh more freely, think more clearly. And when someone tried to pull you back into chaos, when they created a problem out of peace or tried to bait you into an argument just to feel something, you felt it immediately. You no longer felt compelled to fix it or chase them or explain yourself 100 different ways. You saw it for what it was, a pattern you no longer participated in. You started to see love differently. It became less about fireworks and more about warmth, less about intensity and more about integrity. You stopped mistaking unpredictability for chemistry. You started recognizing that real passion doesn't have to hurt. That true love is not something you earn through emotional endurance. It's something you experience through mutual safety. And with that realization, you became harder to manipulate. You no longer responded to guilt. You didn't fall for the bait of false intimacy. You no longer tolerated the cycle of drama and apology, conflict and reconciliation, tension and brief relief. You realized that love doesn't have to be chaotic to be real. That sometimes the most powerful relationships are the quietest ones, the ones that don't demand all of your energy just to survive. And you no longer find calm boring. You find it beautiful. You find it healing. You find it revolutionary. You find it to be the most powerful indicator that you're finally free. There was a time when the idea of being alone felt like punishment. It wasn't just the silence that scared you, it was what came with the silence. The thoughts, the doubt, the emptiness. You were terrified that if you sat still long enough, the weight of what you'd been avoiding would finally catch up to you. You weren't running from people, you were running from yourself, from the grief you hadn't acknowledged, from the truth you weren't ready to name, from the loneliness that lingered, even in crowded rooms and so-called connections. So you stayed busy. You filled your calendar, your space, your heart with distractions. Anything to keep from hearing your own voice. You stayed in relationships that drained you because at least they were something. You tolerated disrespect disguised as love because walking away felt like failure. You told yourself it wasn't that bad, that everyone has their flaws, that being alone would be worse. You swallowed your needs to avoid rocking the boat. You played small to keep the peace. You traded authenticity for attachment. And maybe you didn't see it clearly back then, but you were settling not just for less from others, but for less from yourself. You were clinging to connections that cost you your peace because the thought of waking up alone felt heavier than the weight you were already carrying. There were nights you stared at your phone, hoping it would light up with something, anything that would remind you that you mattered. There were mornings you stayed in bed longer than necessary because getting up meant facing the truth that you were more alone than you wanted to admit. You told yourself stories to justify staying in situations that weren't aligned. You confused familiarity with love. You mistook attention for affection. You believed that someone choosing you even inconsistently was better than no one choosing you at all. And so you stayed too long. You gave too much. You lost pieces of yourself trying to hold on to people who were never really holding you. But eventually something shifted. Maybe it wasn't one big moment. Maybe it was a series of small, quiet realizations. Maybe it was waking up one day and realizing that the person beside you didn't actually see you. Maybe it was feeling more lonely in a relationship than you ever did on your own. Maybe it was catching yourself waiting to be loved better, seen deeper, understood more fully, and realizing how much life you were wasting in that waiting. Maybe it was the growing awareness that you couldn't keep abandoning yourself to be loved by someone else. That the cost had become too high. That you were tired not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Tired of explaining, of proving, of performing. Tired of trying to be enough for someone who would never see your fullness. So you stopped. Maybe not all at once. Maybe you eased into it one boundary at a time. But you started walking away from what wasn't real, wasn't healthy, wasn't sustainable. You started sitting in the discomfort of solitude. You let yourself feel the silence you once feared. You turned inward, not to escape, but to heal. And it hurt. The unraveling always does. You cried more than you thought you would. You felt the ache of absence in your bones. You questioned whether you had made the right choice. But something inside of you, something deep and ancient, kept whispering, "This is what coming home feels like." You began to learn that being alone isn't the same as being lonely. Loneliness is what you feel when you're disconnected from yourself. Aloneness is what you feel when you're finally safe enough to return to your own heart. You began to rediscover parts of you that had been buried beneath years of trying to be lovable. You laughed at things again, real, belly-deep laughter. You started creating without needing an audience. You danced in your kitchen, cooked meals for yourself, talked to the sky, lit candles not for anyone else, but just because it felt good to care for your own space. You learned the sound of your own voice without it being filtered through someone else's expectations. You learned how to self-soothe, how to self-validate, how to self-celebrate. And in that space of solitude, you stopped chasing. You stopped trying to convince anyone to stay. You stopped bending just to be chosen. You no longer needed external validation to feel worthy. Your relationship status stopped defining your value. You no longer felt shame about being on your own. In fact, you began to protect your solitude fiercely, not because you were bitter, but because you had tasted the richness of your own company. You realized that you are not incomplete. That being alone doesn't mean being broken. That solitude can be sacred when you've done the work to be at peace with yourself. People noticed. Some didn't understand. They asked if you were lonely, if you were still waiting, if you were still hoping for someone to come along. And you smiled. Not because you weren't open to love, but because you were no longer hungry for it. No longer desperate. No longer willing to trade your soul just to be held. You had become the source of your own safety, your own affection, your own joy. You weren't afraid of silence anymore. It had become your sanctuary. And when love does come, if it does, it won't be to complete you. It won't be to save you. It won't be a lifeline or a rescue or a project. It will be a reflection, a mirror of the wholeness you already hold. But until then, or even if never, you are full, you are enough. You are not lacking. You are not waiting. You are not afraid, because you've learned that your own presence is not something to run from, it's something to return to. Again and again, until it feels like the safest place you've ever known. There was a time when setting a boundary felt like betrayal. You'd lie awake at night rehearsing how to say no in a way that wouldn't make anyone upset. You'd over-explain, over-apologize, soften your truth just enough to make it palatable for others. You wanted to be understood so badly, you shrunk your needs into a version that wouldn't inconvenience anyone. You weren't protecting yourself, you were protecting people's comfort. And you told yourself that was love, that was compassion, that was kindness. But deep down it was fear. Fear of being seen as selfish, fear of being rejected, fear of being too much or not enough all at once. So you let people push past your limits, not because you didn't have any, but because enforcing them felt dangerous. You stayed in conversations that drained you. You said yes when your body screamed no. You took on more than you could carry just to keep the peace. You allowed your time, your energy, your space to be accessed like an open door, hoping that if you just gave enough, people would love you right. You abandoned your own needs to secure connection. But it was never real connection, it was performance. And it left you exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. You gave so much and still felt unseen. You bent so far and still felt like a burden. And maybe for a while you blamed yourself. You thought your expectations were the problem. You convinced yourself that strong boundaries were walls, that they pushed people away. You thought that being loving meant being endlessly available, always understanding, constantly flexible. You learned to associate your worth with how much you could endure. And every time someone pushed past your limits and you stayed quiet, you sent yourself a message: my needs don't matter. Every time you allowed behavior that hurt you and justified it as love, you reinforced the belief that loving people means losing yourself. But something inside of you began to shift. Maybe it was the slow erosion of self, the way your soul began to ache under the weight of all that pretending. Maybe it was a breaking point, a moment where your silence became too loud to ignore. Maybe it was the realization that love without respect isn't love at all. Whatever it was, you started to question the cost of always being the one to bend. You started to notice how peace built on your silence wasn't peace, it was suppression. And slowly, you started to reclaim your space, not with rage, not with revenge, but with clarity, with truth, with the quiet decision to stop betraying yourself for the comfort of others. At first, it was hard, terrifying even. Saying no felt like ripping something out of your chest. You still over-explained. You still looked for their understanding, their approval. You felt the guilt rise like a wave every time you chose yourself. But you didn't run from it. You let it be there. You learned to sit with it. And then you realized that guilt is not always a sign you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it's just the echo of old conditioning, the belief that love has to come at the expense of yourself. And you started to see it for what it was, a signal that you were unlearning, a sign that you were choosing truth over trauma, boundaries over burnout, self-respect over self-abandonment. You began to speak differently, with more intention, with more confidence. You didn't yell. You didn't defend. You simply stated what was and what wasn't okay. You stopped justifying your boundaries to people who never honored them in the first place. You stopped trying to make people comfortable with your growth. You let your no be enough. Not because you were trying to be harsh, but because you finally understood that your energy is sacred. Your peace is sacred. Your body, your mind, your heart sacred. And sacred things are protected, not handed out freely to whoever demands them. People noticed. Some didn't like it. The ones who benefited from your lack of boundaries tried to guilt you back into compliance. They called you cold, distant, selfish. They mistook your self-honoring as rejection because they had only ever known a version of you who made herself small for their comfort. But others respected it. The right people leaned in, not away. They didn't need access to every part of you to feel close to you. They honored your no without punishment. They saw your boundaries not as rejection, but as clarity, as safety, as trust. You started to see that boundaries don't ruin relationships, they reveal them. They show you who's capable of respecting your truth. They show you who only loved you when you were easy and who stays when you become honest. You stop trying to be digestible. You stop trying to be palatable. You let your full self take up space, knowing that whoever can't meet you there is not meant to walk with you. You also begin to feel something new: freedom. The kind that comes from knowing you can trust yourself to protect your own heart. The kind that comes from no longer waiting for someone else to draw the line. You became your own safe place. And in that safety, you found peace. Not the kind that requires silence or self-sacrifice, but the kind that is rooted in truth. The kind that allows you to show up fully, knowing that you can love deeply without losing yourself in the process. You no longer confuse guilt with wrongdoing. You no longer confuse boundaries with rejection. You know now that boundaries are a form of love, real love. The kind that starts with you, the kind that says, I will not abandon myself even if it makes you uncomfortable. The kind that says, I can love you and still choose me. The kind that doesn't require you to bleed just to prove you care. You hold your boundaries now not with shame, not with fear, but with grace, with conviction, with the quiet, steady strength of someone who finally knows their worth.